The scream that tore through the quiet parking lot on a warm Thursday afternoon was the kind of sound that stops a stranger's heart before their mind even understands why. A woman in a red blouse was being choked against a car door by a man twice her size, her feet barely touching the pavement, her eyes wide with a terror that no one should ever have to feel in broad daylight, surrounded by grocery carts and minivans and the ordinary hum of an ordinary day. What happened in the next 60 seconds would change 3 lives forever, and reveal a truth so shocking that even the men who intervened could never have imagined it. Before we go further into this story, if you believe in kindness, compassion, and second chances, please take a moment to like this video, drop a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Oxley Stories so you never miss a story like this one. And we would love to know, where are you watching from today? Wherever you are, whatever you're going through, know that this community sees you, and we are so glad you're here with us. Her name was Wren Calloway, and until 11 months ago, she had believed that her life was, if not perfect, at least stable. She had a townhouse with a crooked mailbox she kept meaning to fix, a job at a pediatric dental office where she genuinely loved calming down frightened 5-year-olds, and a marriage that had slowly, quietly, curdled into something she no longer recognized. Her husband, Derek Voss, had not always been cruel. In the beginning, he had been charming in the specific way that later made her distrust her own judgment. Attentive, funny, protective in a way that had felt like love and only later revealed itself to be control wearing love's clothing. By the time she filed for divorce, Wren had learned to read the weather in Derek's jaw, the way a sailor reads clouds before a storm. She had learned to make herself smaller in rooms. She had learned, most painfully, that leaving him on paper did not mean he would ever actually let her go. The parking lot where it happened belonged to a strip mall on the edge of town, the kind with a dry cleaner, a nail salon, and a bank with blue awnings that flapped gently in the breeze. Wren had gone there on her lunch break to deposit a check and pick up a birthday card for her sister. She had not expected to see Derek's truck parked 3 spaces down from hers, and by the time she registered it, he was already out of the vehicle and walking toward her with the particular controlled fury she had spent 2 years of therapy learning to fear correctly. He had been served with the final divorce papers that morning. He wanted her to know exactly how that made him feel. What Wren did not know, what nobody in that parking lot knew yet, was that 18 feet away, a man named Callum Reyes had just stepped out of the bank with his 8-year-old daughter Junie's hand in his, mid-sentence about whether they had time to stop for ice cream before her piano lesson. Callum was not the kind of man who went looking for trouble. He was a single father who had spent the last 3 years rebuilding a life for himself and his daughter after his wife Marisol died of an aggressive cancer that had given them only 4 months of warning, and if you had asked him that morning what his biggest concern was, he would have said it was whether Junie's piano teacher would notice she hadn't practiced her scales. He had no idea that in the next few minutes, every instinct he had spent his whole life restraining, the instinct to protect, to intervene, to put his own body between danger and someone who could not defend themselves, was about to be tested in front of his own daughter. The first thing Callum registered was not the scream but the silence that came right before it, a specific kind of silence that some part of his brain, some ancient watchful part that had nothing to do with logic, recognized as wrong before his conscious mind caught up. He turned his head and saw a man's hand close around a woman's throat, saw her body slam back against the door of a black sedan, saw her hands scrabbling uselessly at a forearm that did not move. He did not think about it. He did not calculate risk or consequence or the fact that he had his daughter with him. He simply let go of Junie's hand, said the word "stay" in a voice she had never heard him use before, and moved. Wren's vision had already started to gray at the edges by the time she felt the pressure on her throat suddenly vanish, felt her body drop the 2 inches it had been suspended, felt cool air rush back into lungs that had been screaming for it. She did not immediately understand what had happened. She only knew that Derek's face, inches from hers a moment ago, was gone, and in its place was a stranger's shoulder, broad and solid, positioned between her and the men who had just tried to kill her in a parking lot in the middle of the afternoon. She slid down the side of the car and sat hard on the pavement, one hand pressed to her bruising throat, gasping, shaking, disoriented by how fast the world had tilted from grocery list normal to nearly dying. Derek did not go down easily. He was a big man, accustomed to being the strongest presence in any room he entered, and Callum's intervention had caught him off guard more than it had overpowered him. For a few tense, terrifying seconds, the 2 men grappled beside the car, Callum's hands locked on Derek's wrists, forcing them away and down, his voice low and steady even as his heart hammered against his ribs, not shouting, not threatening, just repeating one sentence over and over like a mantra. "It's over, you're done, step back, it's over." A small crowd had begun to gather at a distance, the way crowds do, phones rising, voices murmuring, someone already dialing 911 in a panicked half-whisper. Junie stood exactly where her father had told her to stay, her small hands pressed over her mouth, watching the only parent she had left fight a stranger in a parking lot, and not once did she cry out or run, because some children learn very young how to be brave when bravery is the only option available. It took almost 2 full minutes, which felt, to everyone involved, like 20. Before Derek finally stumbled back, breathing hard, his face a mask of humiliated rage, and made the calculation that a crowd with phones out was not a crowd he could afford to keep fighting in front of. He spat something venomous in Ren's direction, something about how this wasn't over, how she would regret this, and then he was gone, peeling out of the parking lot with a screech that left a thin curl of rubber smoke hanging in the air behind him. Nobody stopped him. Nobody had the presence of mind to get a full license plate in the chaos, though 2 witnesses managed partial numbers, and the police, when they arrived 11 minutes later, took statements from everyone including Callum, whose hands, Ren noticed even in her daze, were shaking now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go. She would remember, for the rest of her life, the specific way he crouched down in front of her afterward. Not looming over her the way Derek always had, but lowering himself to her eye level, making himself smaller and less threatening, the way you might approach a frightened animal. He asked her name. He asked if she could breathe okay. He asked if there was someone he could call for her, and when she said, in a voice made raw and strange by the bruising already blooming across her throat, that there wasn't really anyone, something in his expression shifted. Not pity, she would later realize, but a kind of quiet recognition, the look of a man who also knew what it was to stand alone in the wreckage of a life that used to have more people in it. The paramedics checked her over at the scene and gently suggested the ER for imaging, given the pressure that had been applied to her throat, and it was Callum, without being asked, who offered to follow behind her car in his own, just to make sure she got there safely, just to make sure Derek wasn't circling back. Junie, riding in the back seat of her father's car, kept twisting around to check that the woman in the red blouse's car was still visible behind them, as if she had personally taken on the job of keeping watch. Ren would learn much later that Junie had cried that night, not from fear exactly, but from the enormous, confusing weight of having watched her father run toward danger instead of away from it, and from a child's dawning understanding that the world contained people who hurt other people for no reason she could name. If this story has moved you already, we would be so grateful if you could hit that like button right now, and if you have a moment, tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from today. This community has grown because of viewers just like you sharing these stories with people who need a little hope, and we can't thank you enough for being part of it. The emergency room that evening was a blur of fluorescent lights and paperwork and a doctor with kind, tired eyes who documented the bruising on Ren's neck with a careful, clinical thoroughness that felt, somehow, like the first time in months anyone had taken what she was going through seriously enough to write it down. Callum sat in the waiting room the entire time, Junie asleep with her head on his lap and a granola bar wrapper crumpled in her small fist, and when Ren finally emerged, hollow-eyed and exhausted with a soft brace around her throat, she found him still there, having refused to leave despite 2 texts from his sister offering to pick Junie up so he could go home. He drove her back to the strip mall parking lot to retrieve her car, waited until the engine started, and only then did he hand her a folded piece of paper with his phone number on it, saying simply that if Derek ever came near her again, day or night, she should call him before she called anyone else, because he lived 12 minutes away and he meant it. Ren did not call him that first week. She told herself it was because she didn't want to burden a stranger with her chaos, but the truer reason, the one she could only admit to herself late at night when sleep wouldn't come, was that she had spent 2 years learning that men who seemed kind at first were the ones you had to watch most carefully, that Derek himself had once brought her soup when she was sick and held her hand at her father's funeral and told her, in the earliest days, that he had never met anyone who made him feel so understood. She did not trust her own radar for goodness anymore. She had gotten it wrong once, catastrophically, and she was terrified of getting it wrong again in a way that might not just break her heart but end her life. But Derek did not disappear the way she prayed he would. He violated the emergency protective order twice in the following 2 weeks. Once by parking outside her workplace for 45 minutes until a coworker called it in, and once by leaving a bouquet of white roses on her doorstep with a card that read only, "You'll come back, you always do," which was somehow more frightening than any explicit threat could have been, because it revealed how completely he believed he still owned some piece of her future. Each time, Ren's hands shook so badly she could barely dial 911, and each time, after the police had come and gone and the adrenaline had drained out of her, leaving nothing but exhaustion and a bone-deep loneliness, she found herself staring at the folded piece of paper still tucked in her wallet, the ink slightly smudged now from being handled so many times without ever being used. It was Junie, oddly enough, who broke the impasse. 3 weeks after the parking lot, Ren went back to that same bank, not out of bravery but because it was the only branch that had her specific safe deposit box, where she'd started keeping copies of the protective order and photographs of the bruising, evidence she was terrified she'd need one day and equally terrified to look at. And there in the lobby was Junie, sitting cross-legged on the floor drawing on the back of a deposit slip while her father spoke with a teller about setting up a savings account for her college fund. Junie looked up, recognized her instantly despite having only glimpsed her once in a moment of crisis, and said with the guileless directness only a child can manage, "You're the lady my dad saved. Are you okay now? Your neck doesn't look as purple." It was such a small thing, such an unguarded, unpolished observation, that it cracked something open in Ren that 3 weeks of careful avoidance had kept sealed shut. She found herself crying in a bank lobby in front of a stranger's 8-year-old, and Callum, turning from the teller window to see what had happened, crossed the room without hesitation and simply stood beside her, not touching her, not crowding her, just present, until she could breathe steady again. They talked for almost an hour that day, sitting on a bench outside the bank while Junie drew increasingly elaborate horses on the sidewalk with a piece of pink chalk she produced from her backpack like a magician. Callum told her, without being asked, about Marisol. Not the sanitized version people usually gave, but the real one, the 4 months of watching someone he loved disappear a little more each week, the particular guilt of feeling relieved when it was finally over, the way Junie had stopped talking almost entirely for 2 months afterward and how the silence in his house had nearly broken him. He told her he understood, in his own way, what it meant to lose the life you thought you were going to have and be forced to build a completely different one out of the wreckage, alone, while everyone around you expected you to just manage. Ren, in turn, told him more than she had told anyone except her therapist about the slow erosion of the last 4 years, about how Derek had convinced her that her friends were jealous, that her family didn't really love her the way he did, that she was lucky someone as intense as him could love someone as flawed as her, until one day she looked up and realized she had no one left to call except a divorce attorney and a domestic violence hotline she'd found at 2 in the morning. It would be easy, and dishonest, to say that from the bench outside the bank everything got easier. It did not. Derek's behavior escalated rather than receded once he sensed she was slipping fully out of his control, and there was a night in early autumn that Ren still could not speak about without her hands going cold. A night when he broke the lock on her back door at nearly midnight, when she woke to the sound of splintering wood and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its terror, that she might not survive the next 10 minutes. She had called Callum before she called the police, some animal instinct overriding the rational plan she'd rehearsed, and he had told her later, quietly, that he had never driven that fast in his life, that he had left Junie asleep alone in the house for the first time ever with only a text to his sister explaining why, that he had arrived to find police lights already washing red and blue across Ren's front lawn and Derek in handcuffs on the porch, screaming things that would later be used against him in court, and Ren sitting on the curb wrapped in a blanket a responding officer had given her, shaking so hard her teeth chattered even though the night wasn't cold. That was the night Derek was finally taken into custody on a felony charge, the accumulated weight of the protective order violations and the break-in finally enough to hold him, and it was also, though neither of them said it aloud for weeks afterward, the night something between Ren and Callum shifted from careful friendship into something neither of them had words for yet, something built not on the electric, unstable chemistry that had once fooled Ren into mistaking control for devotion, but on the much slower, much rarer foundation of two people who had each been shattered and had chosen, independently, to become gentle instead of hard. We are so grateful you've stayed with us this far into the story. If kindness and second chances mean something to you, please like this video and share it with someone who might need reminding today that not everyone who reaches out a hand wants something in return. And please, let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. This community spans so many countries and cities, and we love seeing where these stories reach. The months that followed were not a fairy tale, and Ren was fiercely protective of the fact that they weren't, because she had learned to distrust anything that felt too easy, too fast, too much like the beginning of a story she'd already lived once. She went back to therapy twice a week instead of once. She joined a support group for survivors that met in the basement of a church with bad coffee and folding chairs, and she found, to her surprise, that sitting in a circle of women who understood exactly what it felt like to doubt your own memory of your own life did more for her healing than almost anything else. She did not let herself fall into anything with Callum quickly. When he asked her to dinner for the first time, 4 months after the bank lobby conversation, she said yes but insisted they meet in public, and she told him plainly, without apology, that she needed to go slowly, that she needed him to understand she might pull away sometimes for reasons that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the version of herself that Derek had spent years constructing out of fear and self-doubt. Callum's response was the thing that finally, fully convinced her he was different. He did not argue, did not sulk, did not try to prove his goodness by pushing harder. He simply said that he had all the time in the world, that Junie had taught him more about patience than anyone in his life, and that he would rather have all of her slowly than a fraction of her fast. Junie, for her part, had appointed herself Ren's unofficial guardian in a way that was equal parts hilarious and heartbreaking. She began asking her father, with increasing frequency, whether Ren could come to her piano recitals, whether Ren liked pancakes or waffles better because she wanted to plan accordingly, whether Ren would maybe, possibly, someday, like to see her room, which she had recently reorganized entirely by color. There was an evening in early winter, 6 months after the parking lot, when Ren sat at Callum's kitchen table helping Junie with a school project about family trees, and Junie had paused mid-glue stick, looked up at her with the unnerving directness that seemed to be a permanent feature of her personality, and asked whether Ren was going to be family now. Ren had not known what to say. She had looked to Callum for help and found him watching the two of them with an expression so full of quiet hope and terror in equal measure that she understood, in that moment, exactly how much was at stake for him too, how much he had at risk in letting anyone new into the small, fiercely protected world he had built for his daughter after Marisol died. The court case against Derek moved slowly, the way these things do, through continuances and pretrial hearings and a defense attorney who tried, predictably, to paint Ren as unstable, as exaggerating, as somehow complicit in her own strangling because she had once, months before the divorce, sent Derek a text saying she still loved him during a moment of confusion and grief that anyone who has ever left an abusive relationship would recognize instantly. It was Callum who sat beside her in the courtroom gallery every single hearing date, taking time off. Work he could not really afford to take, arranging childcare for Junie with a rotating cast of his sister and a trusted neighbor, never once making Ren feel like her trauma was an inconvenience to his schedule. There was a hearing in February, brutal and long, where Ren had to testify in detail about the night of the break-in, had to describe the sound of splintering wood and the specific, animal terror of hearing footsteps in her own home, and when she stepped down from the witness stand afterward, legs unsteady, throat tight with the effort of not crying in front of a room full of strangers, Callum was the first face she found in the gallery, and he did not say anything at all. He just stood, opened his arms, and let her decide whether she wanted to be held, which she did, fiercely, in a way that surprised them both. Derek was ultimately convicted, not of everything the prosecution had hoped for, because the system rarely delivers the full measure of justice a survivor deserves, but of enough to result in a sentence that would keep him away from Ren for years, with a permanent no-contact order attached that would extend well beyond his release. When the verdict was read, Ren did not cry the way she expected to. She felt, instead, a strange and total stillness, as though a held breath she had been carrying for 2 years had finally, fully released. She walked out of the courthouse that afternoon into a sky the color of pale gold, the kind of late winter light that makes even ordinary parking lots look briefly beautiful, and Callum was waiting by his car with Junie, who had been allowed to skip the last hour of school for the occasion and who ran across the courthouse steps the moment she saw Ren's face, not understanding the legal details but understanding, with a child's unerring emotional accuracy, that something heavy had finally been set down. If you have ever had to rebuild your life after someone tried to break it, we hope this story reminds you that you are not alone, and that there are still good people in this world who will run toward danger instead of away from it. Please share this story with anyone who might need that reminder today, and if you haven't already, subscribe to Oxley Stories so you never miss the next one. It would be another year before Callum asked Ren to marry him, and when he finally did, it was not with a grand gesture or a restaurant proposal or anything that would have made for dramatic footage, because both of them had learned, in their different ways, to distrust drama as a substitute for substance. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening in his kitchen, the same kitchen where Junie had once asked if Ren was going to be family, with spaghetti sauce simmering on the stove and Junie, now 9, setting the table with the specific seriousness she brought to every task, when Callum simply took Ren's hand across the counter and told her that he had watched her rebuild an entire life out of the pieces of one that had nearly ended, that he had watched her choose gentleness even when the world had given her every reason to choose bitterness instead, and that he could not imagine building the rest of his life with anyone else. Junie, who had clearly been let in on the plan, produced a small velvet box from her backpack with the triumphant flourish of a magician's assistant, and Ren, laughing and crying in roughly equal measure, said yes before he had even finished getting down on one knee. They were married the following spring in a small ceremony in a backyard strung with fairy lights, no more than 40 guests, most of them the women from Ren's support group who had watched her walk into the church basement as a hollowed-out shell of a person and walk out, over many months, into someone whole again. Junie was the flower girl and took the job with such gravity that she practiced her walk down the aisle for 2 full weeks beforehand. During the reception, in a moment that several guests would later say was the one that undid them completely, Junie stood up unprompted, tapped her small fork against her water glass to get everyone's attention the way she'd seen grown-ups do, and announced to the entire yard that Ren was the bravest person she knew because she had learned to be safe again after someone tried to make her feel like she never would be, and that she, Junie, was very glad her dad had let go of her hand in that parking lot that one time, because otherwise none of this would have happened at all. Ren still keeps the folded piece of paper with Callum's phone number in a small keepsake box on her dresser, the ink faded now almost past legibility, not because she needs the number anymore but because it represents, for her, the exact moment the story of her life stopped being written by fear and started being written by something else entirely. She still attends her support group most months, not because she needs it the way she once did, but because she has become, for newer members, the woman sitting in the corner with the steady eyes who somehow makes the impossible feel survivable, the living proof that the worst chapter of your life is not obligated to be the final one. She thinks often, especially on quiet mornings when Callum is making coffee and Junie is doing homework at the kitchen table and the whole ordinary, unremarkable, precious scene of her rebuilt life spreads out in front of her, about how close she came to never walking into that bank lobby again, how close fear had come to convincing her that no kindness could ever be trusted twice. She is endlessly grateful that a stranger's hand let go of his daughter's for just long enough to save her life, and that in letting go, he somehow ended up holding on to both of them forever. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to believe that kindness still exists in this world, and subscribe to Oxley Stories so you never miss a story like this one again. Before you go, we would love it if you left a comment sharing your own thoughts, maybe a time someone showed you unexpected kindness, or a lesson this story reminded you of, or simply where you're watching from tonight. This community grows stronger every time someone shares a piece of their own heart in the comments, and we read every single one. Somewhere, right now, there is a person sitting in a parking lot, or a kitchen, or a courtroom gallery, wondering if anyone in the world would ever run toward them the way Callum ran toward Ren. And the quiet, stubborn truth this story leaves behind is that sometimes the bravest, most life-changing love story begins not with a kiss, but with a stranger who simply refuses to look away.